Hello everyone, this is Damon with Easy Green Screen, and in this tutorial I'm going to be discussing techniques for extracting high ISO images, and in particular images shot with continuous lighting. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you the camera settings that this image was shot with. And under the camera data we can see that the shutter speed was 1/85th of a second. The aperture was f5.6 and the ISO was 1250. When you are shooting with continuous lighting, you are not going to have enough light to use the optimal camera settings for green screen. For green screen, it's best if your aperture is between f8 and f11. Anything below f8 and you can start getting shallow depth of field and not all of your edges are in focus. If you go above f11, then you can start getting image diffraction. So between f8 and f11 seems to be the best aperture to use. ISO, if you can, you always want to shoot ISO 100, and that is because high ISOs tend to have a lot of noise. And also the shutter speed. 1/85th of the second is a bit slow, especially if you're using continuous lighting, because that's going to pick up any slight camera movement and you'll get a little motion blur from the camera movement, and it's really hard when you start lowering that shutter speed to not blur your image just by pushing the shutter button and the camera moving a little bit. One thing I recommend when shooting green screen is to zoom in and look at the detail in your image and look at the edges so you know what it is that you are working with. At least on a few images in your photo shoot, it's good to really zoom in and look at them. Now what we can see here is there's a lot of color noise, and this is caused by the ISO setting of 1250 in the camera. And if we zoom in, we can see around the edge of the skin here there's some defocusing, and that's probably a combination of the shutter speed, aperture, and the autofocus in the camera. And also in the hair here, when you're deciding whether you want to do single mask or dual mask, you want to do dual mask if you are trying to save these flyaway strands of hair, and if you have the detail in your image to be able to do that. Now, the green screen extraction is not going to be able to get detail back that is not in your image to begin with. And so sometimes it's better to do a single mask extraction and it will actually look better. And I think that is the case with this image, because you can see where there are some of these flyaway strands of hair. You can see if we sample, I mean, these are pure green. They're being completely defocused into the screen. If we go around the hairline, you don't even want to try to keep hair if it looks like that, because if you try to save that, it's not going to look very good in the extraction anyway. So a single mask would be better because we want to crop all of that off and get a nice blended edge to the hairline. And so what I like to do is first, with a high ISO image like this, I like to remove the color noise. That's going to help the extraction. And there's two ways to do that. In Photoshop, under the noise, you have a reduced noise. I don't suggest using this noise reduction method. If you are in CC, I suggest that you use the Camera Raw filter. The noise reduction in Camera Raw is much better. And if we zoom in here, I'm just going to show you, if we come into our noise reduction, and with color noise reduction, usually around 50 is where I like to use it. And in this image, I think 50 does okay. If you use it too high, the color can kind of appear a little bit flat. I think 50 usually does a pretty good job. So I'm just going to apply that here. If you are not in Photoshop CC, then you will not have the Camera Raw filter in your filter menu. Now, if you shot with RAW, you could of course open the Camera Raw, but if you shot with JPEG, you can still open the image as a Camera Raw image under the File Open As command. you'll select the image, and in the Open As drop-down, select Camera Raw. That will open the Camera Raw interface. And then from there, if you go to your noise reduction, we can apply the same noise reduction that we did in the Camera Raw filter in CC. And one thing to point out is if you're opening as a Camera Raw, you'll want to pay attention to the color profile. Just make sure that the color space is selecting the profile that you want. And now the image is open with the color noise reduction applied. Now I will point out one thing, that if you are opening as a Camera Raw, what will happen is next time you open that same image, if you open it normally, it's going to want to open it with the Camera Raw menu. So if you're doing a batch of images, the easiest way to handle this is make a copy of all of your images and then open the copies in Camera Raw. That way your originals will not want to open in Camera Raw in Photoshop. There are a few areas of this image that we'll want to pay attention to when we do the extraction. The first area is the yellow in this lacrosse stick. We'll want to watch for any color shifting in that due to the spill correction. Next is in this jersey, you see there's a yellowish green areas in these stripes. And if I sample those areas, you see on this sample we have a hue of 72, and that falls between the yellow and the greens. And once you get above 70, you can start getting a slight bit of extraction the closer that gets to greens. But if it's kind of a greenish color and not really a chroma key green, it's usually pretty simple to add that back to the foreground. And then the last area is in the lacrosse stick itself, in the strings. I'm going to zoom way in here. And if we sample the color in some of these strings that are more narrow, you can see that those are pretty green. And you can see here we've got about 4 or 5 pixels of defocusing on the edge. So those strings, especially the small ones, are really blending into the green. Now I think we'll probably be able to get these in the extraction and it will look okay, but we'll have to pay attention to this when we extract. So I'm just going to do a single mask extraction here. And I can see that the strings are a bit transparent on a couple of those. And I can barely see a little bit of checkerboard showing through in the greenish yellow areas of the jersey. If we view our mask, we can see those areas that are partially transparent. They're not very transparent, just a little bit. If they were much more transparent, we would be able to see the transparency grid, but we really can't. And against color, all of it looks a little bit better. But what we'll do first is go back into the mask. I'm going to go into the mask settings. And this foreground recovery, this should help us recover areas against the edges of the string, as well as these slight transparent areas in the shirt. I'm just going to turn that up to a value of 75, and you can play with different values depending on your image. Now you can instantly see that recovered those areas in the shirt. The strings look a little bit better. And like I say, this works with areas that are greenish, but if you have areas that are chroma key green, it's not going to recover those areas in the foreground. Let's say if you had a chroma key green logo in the shirt. Now one thing this will do is it tends to harden up the edges of the image. They look a little bit unnatural, so if it gets too hard anyway. So what you want to do is make sure you're using mask feather with that. And by default in single mask, it's a 1/2 of a pixel. I'll just change that to 0.7. And when I use this foreground recovery very high, usually I go around 0.7 on the mask feathering, sometimes up to 1. Now, what I like to do often as well, and I'm going to show you in this image, sometimes I like to do a contract mask. I'll show you if we go 1 pixel. You can see that contracts the edge and gets rid of that slight fringing, but the strings become more narrow. I'm going to really exaggerate this and go up to 3 pixels. And you can see that it really starts chopping away at those strings. And if we didn't have those strings, I would probably go with 1 pixel for this image. But with those strings, I'm just going to turn that off. And I do have another tutorial or another video in this tutorial series that I'm going to show an advanced method for using the contrast mask around the entire image except for the lacrosse stick. But watch the other video for that. And so the last thing that we need to do is recover any spill shifting. Now, you can see that the yellow shifted a bit in this image. If we look at the original, you can see that that yellow dulled in the stick. And in this uniform, if we go back against the color or against the transparency, it doesn't matter, we see just a slight shift in that color as well. So we'll go into the spill correction, and there's a button called Preserve Yellow Clothing Color. And if I check that, it's going to better preserve these yellow colors. You see that stick now, we have the original yellow color back. But what happens is we lose some of that spill correction around the top of the shoulder here, because now we're not correcting for as wide of a color range. And so you could try changing that number until you get something that works best for the entire image. However, I think that 75 against the skin works the best, and we just happen to dull this color a little bit. So there's a couple ways to fix that, and I'm going to show you both ways. We're going to go into the keep or remove areas, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'll just select the quick select tool. I'm going to increase the brush size. Now, if you increase the brush size here while Easy Green Screen is running, Photoshop doesn't like to render this menu very well. However, you still can increase the size here. You can also just change that size in Photoshop before you start as well. But now with the quick select, I can go through and quickly select the area in this shirt that we know we need to remove any spill correction. And you want to make sure that if you select areas around the hair, you remove that from the selection because you want to keep the spill correction there. So I'm going to grab the lasso tool and use the Alt key or Option on Mac. I'm going to remove that area. We'll remove a little more just to be safe. Okay, so now I'll go back to the quick select and just pick up that last bit of the jersey I missed. So that's good enough. Oh, wait, one more time. I'm going to go over this. Sorry about that. Okay, now we should have all the areas in the jersey that I want to remove the color spill correction. I'll click on Remove Spill Correction, and you can see that instantly brings that original color back, and it's got that slight greenish yellow hue that was from the original jersey. Now we could do the same thing on this lacrosse stick, go in and select these yellow areas. What will happen is if we get some of these areas in here that had green reflections on the black area, we would remove spill correction in those areas, and we don't want to do that. I'm going to clear the selection. I'm actually going to show you how I would do this. If it was my own images, I would use this next technique for the stick for every image. I'm just going to apply the extraction here. And for this area in the stick, we can also do that directly in Photoshop. Now, one thing that Easy Green Screen does that there's no other plugin in the world that can do is it gives you a non-destructive layer set. So if I just take this spill correction layer, if I uncheck that, we can instantly see we have no spill correction anywhere in the image. So around the arm, we can see it's green, and in the hair, we've got some green. If I check that back on, you see that the whole image now has spill correction, but this color is shifted. So what we have in the spill correction layer is we have a color that gets blended in color mode with an opacity, and this is the opacity that is set in Easy Green Screen by the spill correction opacity. But we also have a layer mask, and if I hit Alt and click in here, we can see inside the layer mask but we also have a layer mask, and we can paint in that layer mask to paint the spill correction off. So I'm just going to click on the layer mask, and you can see that the layer mask is now selected. We got the box around that, and I'm going to grab a black brush, and I'm going to set the brush hardness all the way up to 100%. That way it's not bleeding over into areas I don't want. Now if I zoom in, I can just paint, and I'm painting that spill correction off because I'm painting black into this layer mask, and that is removing spill correction from this image. Now I'm going to show you here, if I go over into the skin, I'm removing spill correction in those areas as well, which I don't want to do. So I'm going to undo this with Control Z. And just continue on. Just when you get to areas that you want to keep the spill correction, be really careful you don't paint over those. And then you can decrease your brush size and just paint right over those areas that you want to remove the spill correction. Then we have the original color of the lacrosse stick back. One last thing I will show you if you want to help this image blend a little bit better. And remember, we started out with really difficult edges to work with because of the ISO and the noise. So if those are a little bit too rough, what you can do is, if you want to soften up the edges, especially around the hairline, I'm going to make a selection just around the hair. And then we're inside of our mask. If we want to, we can apply a blur just to the mask area, or inside the mask. Now you'll notice when your Gaussian blur pops up, you're seeing a black and white image in there. And that's because we are looking at our mask, and we're actually blurring our mask. So you see, if I really turn this up, I'll show you the effect. You're blurring your mask, and so you're blurring the transparency of your image. But 36 pixels is obviously way too much. But if we just go 2 or 3 pixels, we're softening the transition from foreground to background by blurring that mask. And by making that selection, we did not blur the mask anywhere outside of the hair. We just applied that softening just to the edges of the hair. Anyway, I think the extraction worked good enough to use for most size images. And if you're shooting high ISO images with a lot of noise, you're not going to be able to get as much detail as you will if you're shooting with strobes and using ISO 100 and f11. But you can still get a pretty good extraction that can be used for most purposes. And I think this image actually extracted pretty well. And, oh, one last thing I'll show you too. I'm just going to zoom in here. Those edges that we were talking about that were a little bit rough because of the, we'll go and see if the other side, if we have more. I think this one will work better to show you. But where you have a little bit of those jagged edges because of the noise and the green blending into it, you can go right into your mask and you can paint in the mask. Again, I'm going to grab a paintbrush, and this time I'm going to soften it up just a bit. But we are painting directly in our mask, and we're painting white. You can see we can paint the foreground back in anywhere we want to if we want to clean up any of those areas. And then if you go too far, you start painting the background back in, and I'll undo that here. Anyway, I hope you learned something, and if you're interested in Easy Green Screen, please be sure to visit our website. That is easygreenscreen.com.